You're listening to The Streaming Wars, the podcast that discusses all of the latest happenings regarding your favorite streaming services. Find out which service is winning the war this time around.
Hello everyone and welcome to the latest episode of The Streaming Wars. I'm Dustin and Tony is with me and we are here to discuss everything from May 5th through the 18th. Boy, oh boy, was there a lot of news over the past couple of weeks, and it actually all happened, honestly, within the last week. After weeks and weeks of having very little news. Last episode, obviously, we talked a lot about numbers for a lot of the different services. We do have some more number updates. We've got Disney and Disney Plus numbers, and we've got Paramount Plus numbers as well. But there's some huge news, probably maybe potentially the biggest news we've talked about here on the podcast, which is there are two major streaming services that hypothetically could be coming together in some way, shape, or form because of a new merger. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about another big merger that just news popped up in the last couple of days, potentially happening. And then on top of that, we've got, like I said, some numbers. And then there's, of course, a little bit of sports news, and we're going to wrap up the episode. So we're going to kind of go in reverse, where instead of starting with the service updates, we're going to go jump straight into our main discussion, which is Warner Media and Discovery have announced that they are going to be joining into a new company. Now, specifically, the details on this are AT&T, which has Warner Media under its own current umbrella as part of its company, is going to spin Warner Media off into its own company, and then Discovery is going to come on board, and Warner Media and Discovery are going to create this new unit that is going to be this this major media conglomerate that's going to have a lot of capabilities. Obviously, the Turner stations would be included with that. You've got all of the Discovery networks that would be included in that deal. You've got Discovery Plus, you've got HBO Max, you've got some of the other deals that are in place, or the other elements like the Turner networks. You've got DC Comics, all the stuff that we've talked about here on the podcast when it comes to Warner Media being a giant company in and of itself. It still fell under AT&T. So by spinning it off into its own company, AT&T is going to own about 71% of that company. And then the Discovery stockholders will hold 29% of that company too. The merger is set to be in the $40 to $50 billion range when it comes to the valuation of the company. Now, there's a lot to discuss here. The first thing I want to discuss is this is an odd situation specifically because, as we've talked about recently, AT&T has been looking at selling off elements of Warner Media. They had a deal in place, which we'll see what ends up happening with that deal, but they had a deal in place to spin off Crunchyroll, sell that off to Sony, and Sony was going to pay $1 billion for Crunchyroll. There's been lots of talk about Warner Media, the Warner Interactive Entertainment element, the gaming side of Warner Media being sold off, and various different elements, potentially specific developers that are game publishers that are creating games. And then there was elements of there was talk about DC Comics being sold and then being potentially licensed back, the characters being licensed by Warner Media. So there's been a lot of talk about spinning off different elements within Warner Media just because AT&T has been said to looking for ways of getting a return on their investment because they did pay $85 billion just a couple years ago and they haven't seen exactly a huge return on their investment, and they're getting a lot of heat when it comes to the stockholders. So there's that. But then recently we heard the deal in place where DirecTV spun out of AT&T into its own new company where AT&T retains ownership of that, a certain percentage ownership of that, but there's another company that's owning a chunk of that as well, and they're looking to do that. Interestingly, DirecTV was a merger that AT&T brought into themselves just a couple of years before Warner Media, and it's another one that the stockholders have been saying was a bad idea. So Warner Media being spun off into its own thing, I will say the stock jumped up a little bit after all of this happened for both Discovery and AT&T. But it seems odd. It seems odd that they spent as much money as they did and now they're selling it. or potentially valuing it at much, much lower than it previously than they previously paid. So there's that side of it, which is the business side of it. We'll get into the streaming side in a second, but as far as the business goes, do you think it was? What do you think this is? Do you think this is a case of regret and trying to figure out some way of making something out of nothing? Or are you thinking that they've just realized that they need to focus they need to focus their attention on what they're good at, which is telecommunications? Conveniently, Verizon just did something very similar. They're selling off all of their entertainment side of stuff with Yahoo and AOL. They're selling all that elements of their business off. So what do you think this is?
Man, what a way for you to come back from vacation. You just get, oh man, all this news. I couldn't believe it at first, because sometimes in our preparation for this show, we scour a lot of news. There's a lot of BS out there. And then there's, actually reasonable sources. And so there are a whole lot of rumors out there. I know from the DC Comics side, there was this talk that DC Comics would be sold. And that's been going around for a while. And those rumors really didn't pan out until not 2 days ago. But right, there's just always these types of rumors, and so I couldn't believe this at first, but this is happening. This is kind of crazy. I think AT&T has gotten to the point in their executives, and you hear Stanky has been talking about how great, we're going to do this integration with Warner Media, spin out HBO Max and try to make that a streaming thing. Really, though, I think AT&T and AT&T executives and shareholders have looked at their investments in media, right? Streaming, buying, the Warner catalog, operating, a cable TV channel. Like there's so much media that's happened there, and video games and comics is. I think AT&T shareholders have just said, "Hey, this experiment is not working. All this debt is on our books. It's really, hurting our business. These streaming services, this content creation machine, it's not creating cash as much as they would prefer, right? If you think about a different company, but it's a different situation, right? Disney bought, the Star Lucasfilm, and they bought Pixar, right? Those acquisitions, right, were a couple $1 billion in total. At the time, but they have earned their money for Disney. I mean, the first Star Wars film, Star Wars Episode 7, made, I know it was like 1.9, maybe $2 billion, right? And Disney bought Lucasfilm for like $4 billion, right? That's a great return on investment just in one film, right? The media side just hasn't panned out for AT&T, and that's due to probably just mismanagement and the fact that you have an ISP trying to control the content. Shareholders have just said enough, right? Let's divorce ourselves of the content, right? So you have the media itself, you have the video game side, which is its own different business model. In the video game world, it's just quite competitive, right? It's a lot. You can go a lot into the news, and it's pretty cutthroat. That's something that AT&T doesn't want. The comics business, like retaining the licenses to these characters like Batman and Superman, would make them money, but at the same time, comics is not necessarily a sexy thing for a company like AT&T to own, and trying to manage that as well, because the comics themselves, it's a very low margin business. So why would AT&T be in the business of that? So I think this experiment it's failed. And I think that we've seen that over the years. It hasn't worked out. And I think there's a larger issue. If you remember at the time, Comcast bought NBC Universal, and that was the first, ISP, or maybe the second ISP. Anyway, that was one of the big ISPs, like getting into content space, and people were worried. The merger took forever of it being allowed to happen. You have AT&T getting into, Time Warner and really getting the content space there. Verizon sort of got in the business, right? They're another big internet company, ISP, whatever. And they bought AOL and Yahoo sort of tried to start its own streaming thing, but that fell pretty hard. So the idea at the time was vertical integration is where you need to go. And people were looking at Netflix. It's like, hey, you are spending so much money on content. You are racking up a whole lot of debt to pay for content, and this is going to be unsustainable. But if you have an ISP, right, they own the actual, they own the infrastructure that streaming services will use, right? And they own the actual broadband, the wires, copper wires, the fiber, right? And you can pair the internet service with the content creation part. Now, at the time, people were worried, but I think that model has failed. You have executives from one completely different business model trying to operate a media conglomerate. And it's going to be hard. But as we've seen, though, in the streaming wars, right, Dustin, the way to get on top and the way to be a sustainable company is not with the vertical integration with an ISP or something like that. It's about horizontal scale. And as long as there's a reason why analysts focus so much on how many subscribers they get, and it's unfortunately why we talk about it so much, is for a streaming service to be profitable, you have to have a large enough scale. It's the economy of scale. And we're seeing that play out. And those are the most successful streaming services, right? Netflix is, the king. Amazon Prime there's a crap ton of subscribers there. Part of that is for other uses of Prime service, but there's a large number of users for that. Disney Plus, right? The reason why that's actually a positive, I don't think it's a making profit for Disney, but it's definitely giving investors hope, and shareholders are happy because it's got like 105 million subscribers or 103 million subscribers, something like that. It's about scale. Even Discovery Plus, right, is on good track for growth. And it's growing quicker than definitely like HBO Max is, or HBO and HBO Max, however they count those numbers. So the way how streaming is going to work is for the big companies, it's horizontal scale. It's not vertical integration. That model, I think, is moving away. To look over and use, AT&T and the Warner Media as a case study, I think Comcast is going to get to a similar point in the future of where operating NBC Universal just isn't going to be worth it. And they have their own like debt issues of their own, but it seems like they're, and they don't have that many hostile investors going on, hostile, stakeholders really trying to push against the debt themselves. So I think that's going to be on the wayside in the future. It's just interesting. The era of vertical integration is going away. The one thing, though, that I like the idea of Discovery Plus and HBO Max merging together. There's a little graphic that shows all the different, major pieces of content that they will, as an umbrella, they would own, like Discovery Channel, Food Network, TLC, HGTV, Warner Brothers, HBO, CNN, TNT, like TBS, right? That's a very diverse portfolio, and that covers that type of TV content, that type of content where you can just have it on the background and just work, right? That's a lot of Discovery's content, and that's why they actually grown they've actually been quite successful, better than I think analysts' estimates. And then you have like the more of higher end curated content and movies of the HBO Max side. And they also have a news network there, and there's a lot to do there. So I actually like these two companies merging together. And I think that by themselves, they're not big enough to really get regulators concerned, right? There's no way that it's people going to be concerned, I think, for antitrust reasons, because Netflix is already huge. Disney is already huge, and they have a whole bunch of properties on their own. Prime is doing some things. Apple is buying a whole lot of, stuff going on. So I think from the antitrust side, I think that this merger will be approved, hopefully sooner than later, because you can announce a merger, but until it's approved by regulators, it's going to be just kind of out there, and that's going to be some cause for concern. So that's kind of my overall view of the situation. I actually like the sell. I think AT&T wasn't doing a good job handling everything that a media company would have to deal with. I think the era of vertical integration is going away. I like the content being merged together. I think it's a good mix, and I think it's something that other streaming services do not provide at the moment. Just such a diverse portfolio. So that's kind of like my 3 big points. How do you feel about some of them?
I'll say this. I would have never in my wildest dreams thought that this would have been the weird merger that would have taken place. But honestly, when you think about it, it actually makes perfect sense. The type of content that Discovery puts together is very, very different than the content that Warner Media already has. And obviously, both of these companies are bringing different elements to the table, but a lot of the content that is coming from Discovery is unscripted content. That is not something that you actually have a ton of at Warner Media. Outside of a couple of shows here or there that are unscripted, most of those shows are scripted. They have a lot of scripted shows that they make for other networks. They make a lot of shows, obviously, for themselves. They have lots of movies. Discovery doesn't have any sort of feature film studio aspect of their company. They don't have that. So they don't have that aspect. They don't have news. They don't have sport. Well, they have a little bit of sports, but they don't have the sports like Turner Sports. So there's when you start looking at what you're bringing, what each company is bringing to the table, it's actually a very, very good mix and actually really creates a larger group that works well. It reminds me a lot of the Disney stuff, like you were mentioning with like Lucasfilm or Pixar or Marvel, where they're bringing something in that works alongside what they already have, but isn't taking away from what they already have. And that's what this is. Discovery's bringing a lot of unscripted stuff to the table, and Warner Brothers is bringing a lot of the other media elements to the table that Discovery doesn't have. So it actually works. Now, whether or not it is going to work long term, I honestly think that this is probably a game changer when it comes to like the last of the legacy media companies changing. One, because it gets Warner Media away from AT&T, or at least not under the immediate control over AT&T. Obviously, AT&T stockholders are still going to own a huge chunk of this company, but it's not going to be directly underneath the leadership within AT&T, and I think that's crucial to have Warner Media succeed long term. I think a lot of the decisions or I should say, some of the decisions that have been made over the past couple of years since Warner Media got brought into AT&T have been very questionable and haven't been exactly well thought through. I think that's going to change when you have somebody who's from media in charge of a company and running it as if it's a media company and not a way to make your other businesses prosper. And I think that's important. Of course, one of the questions that comes up is, well, what happens with the leadership? It's been said that the Discovery CEO, Zaslav, will be the new CEO of this new company, and they've got a name that they said they're looking to release. Maybe by the time this episode releases, they'll have named it. But there is
HBO Max.
I doubt that. So there was a funny thing where I saw where it was like, what happens when you take a Max and a Plus and you join it together? It becomes the ultimate package. And I was like, well, you're not wrong. I mean, everybody does have a Plus.
Supremum. That's a good math term that no one's going to understand. Yeah, I hope they actually have a good name. I know that's kind of ruined your point, but man, I really hope they pick a good name, because there's been so many bad names, and HBO Max is very confusing. Discovery Plus, like, I hope that's better. Anyway, go ahead.
I saw one that was pretty amusing. It said WMD, Warner Media Discovery, but WMD obviously also stands for Weapons of Mass Destruction, so there was that, and I was like, well, that's amusing, but I don't think that'll be the case. But yeah, I mean, overall, they said that they have a name coming out, so it's not going to be Warner Media and it's not going to be Discovery. It's not like Discovery is owning Warner Media, Warner Media is owning Discovery. It will be some sort of new name for the company, which obviously changes it. I'm sure Warner is going to be incorporated in some way, shape, or form in that name, just because that is the legacy company out of all of the companies involved. But the new CEO will be the current Discovery CEO. And we've talked about this before, and I will say, I am not one to skirt around the fact that I looked at Discovery Plus and just kind of dismissed it for a while because it's not content that I like. But I don't know, you have no idea how many people I've heard who have subscribed to it, because it is that, like, mindless type content where you can just turn it on in the background like you've described it. So I personally have dismissed it. And I also, the one thing that I kept saying was I thought it was ridiculous how many times the CEO at Discovery was saying they were going to announce details, and they kept saying it for months and months and months, and they weren't doing anything. And then finally they announced it, and then it was like literally a month later they were rolling it out. It was like very little marketing going into it. I guess they knew exactly what they were doing because they were marketing to the people who already use their network, or, use and watch their networks. And that makes sense. So I think overall, it'll be interesting to see what ends up coming out. Killar has been said, who's currently obviously the CEO at Warner Media, is looking at an exit package. That's got to suck for him because he's literally been in the role for just over a year. And he's probably like the most hated man in Hollywood because of the whole break-in theatrical window thing. Even if it did work, he's still going to be, that's what he's always going to be known for, is the person who disrupted Hollywood. And he's probably not going to have a lot of success going somewhere else within entertainment, just because so many people within entertainment didn't like that idea, even if it did work. And it did work. It worked for HBO Max and it worked for the theaters, but nobody liked that idea, and that's what he's probably going to be remembered for. So that's unfortunate for him. As far as what happens,
I think that's out of a whole bunch of things with AT&T and dealing with dealing within media. I think the backlash of doing the dual release or dropping Warner Brothers films on HBO Max at the same time as it will launch on theaters I think that was probably one of the nails in the coffin for this AT&T experiment, just because of the amount of backlash from creators. And there was just a bunch of bad PR. And I could see out of all the other things that's happening with Warner Media that was kind of like, all right, this isn't worth the effort, right? We are getting slammed in the news. We're getting slammed by creators, and there might be fear that new creators aren't going to work with them. Maybe not new creators. I think new creators will work with them, but the established greats, right? Christopher Nolan's made a lot of money for Warner Brothers over the years, and disrupting that relationship is really not something that is good for business. So I think just the PR pushback is one of the many other reasons why AT&T is divorcing itself from Warner Media.
Honestly, there was talk about potentially. There was a lot of different talk about, and we've talked about it here on the podcast as well, about what would the future of these media companies really be. Disney sits at the top. Netflix is up there because of how much they're valued, but not necessarily because of the amount of content they have or anything like that. It's just they're the top dog when it comes to streaming. But as far as media companies, they just happen to be really high up there because of their value of their stock and things like that. Disney is one of the only legacy companies that's really sitting up high. And while Warner Media is a company that consistently does very well in the box office, has huge volume of content that they produce, whether it be for television or film, they make a lot of content, a lot more content than actually Disney does. And they're just not as profitable or as big as Disney. And Disney obviously has other elements within their business that make them bigger than, a company like Warner Media was prior to AT&T buying them out. Then you have, you've got other companies out there. Fox got scooped up by Disney. You have Sony out there. You've got NBC Universal, and you've got Paramount. These are the last players when it comes to legacy media. Really, it's one of those questions of how can you really succeed when you've got these massive giant companies combining forces. One of the reasons why Disney arguably is so big is because of the acquisitions they've made with Marvel, Fox, Lucasfilm, and Pixar, and how they've bulked up the amount of content that they can produce because of those acquisitions. And I think that's one of the reasons they're set up for success going forward when it comes to streaming. Netflix has obviously gotten really good about pumping money and creating content. Whether or not it always works or not is arguable, but they're really good about doing that. Amazon is starting to get a foundation when it comes to having consistent content on their service, and they've got the money to do it. Apple is one of the ones that's questionable when you look at the media companies, the legacy media companies that have been around for, over 50 years, there's very little that some of these companies can do. Like, we've heard talk about NBC Universal looking at the potential of creating some sort of version of Peacock for an international market, but not Peacock because Peacock wouldn't resonate with an international market. You've got Paramount Plus, which was CBS All Access and was doing well, but they needed to figure out some way of going international too. And now they're going to be going up against the likes of Disney Plus, who have obviously a huge head start, Netflix, who has a huge head start, HBO Max and potentially Discovery coming together and potentially getting into those markets a lot sooner than, NBC Universal. And it leaves NBC Universal and Paramount or Viacom CBS in a unique position where they end up coming together, or they're going to phase out, or they're going to be content, or they'll just have to be content with being smaller, because it's very unlikely they're going to be able to compete with these larger players with what is available out there. Sure, they could potentially scoop up some things here or there, how like NBC Universal scooped up rights to WWE stuff so that they could have it on the service. They spent a lot of money, but there's only a limit on how much money some of these companies can spend. So I think this is probably one of the moments within the streaming wars that really is going to shift everything. I truly believe that HBO Max is a great service, and I don't have any doubt that it will continue to be successful as we get to that ad-supported tier and the international rollout. But I think combining it with the likes of Discovery content, whether or not that happens right away or it's a tier or however they work it, they'll figure it out and we'll know whatever's going to happen by probably next year or 2023, because they're saying the merger is not going to actually be able to go through until at the earliest mid-2022. And then obviously there's going to be restructuring within the companies, and then there'll be, this new version of whatever's going to be the streaming service that'll come in the future. But we don't know what that is, and it's going to be obviously some time. But I think if the merger ends up going through as it is expected to, this really is going to be one of those moments that's going to change the landscaping of streaming, because it sets HBO Max higher than it already is. It sets Discovery Plus way higher than it already is. And I think that's a huge deal going forward for these companies.
Yeah, I mean, goodness sakes, there's still a whole lot more that we could talk about. Let's talk about Zaslav. I really had no clue much about, Discovery's CEO, because there's hardly many CEOs I actually pay attention to, right? Stanky is one, Killar of, Warner Media is another. Really was into Bob Iger's story and how he basically made Disney to where he is now. Reed Hastings, just because I'm a tech person anyway. So there's not many other CEOs I really pay attention to, but doing some digging on Zaslav, he came in and changed the mindset of Discovery, because at the time it was really focused on its cable business, but his aim at the company was to make it more of a content company and really focus more on the content side of things. And I don't know if people can tell over the years, but Discovery, like the channel has in the channels that it operates, the content has been better. Now, I'm not going to say it's going to earn awards or something like that, but they really have invested in content. Have really focused on, okay, what do consumers of their brand, what do they really enjoy, and really tailor content to them. So in hearing his enthusiasm for being able to work with the amount of properties that are in the Warner Media backlog, just his reverence for talking about Batman and Superman in one of his interviews after this merger was announced and all the other properties that are there. I actually think that from a caretaking side, I think Zaslav will be a good overseer for the Warner Media content, and actually will have some type of vision for it and invest in their library of content and do something with that. And I'm not saying anything necessarily bad about Killar. I think that he was kind of put in a crazy situation of, okay, I've worked at Hulu, I kind of know how this is going, but then you got AT&T executives right over your shoulder, and what do you do anyway? But I really think that Warner Media's library will be in good hands with Zaslav and Discovery moving forward. What are your thoughts on the change of leadership? Because say what you want about HBO Max being a decent service in terms of economics, or Warner Media as a good investment for AT&T, it has top-notch content.
I honestly don't think it's going to change. I think Zaslav comes across as a guy who appreciates content for whatever, regardless of what it is. If there's an audience for it, they're going to make it. Discovery has proven that, because they have made a lot of very, in my mind, I know not everybody's, but questionable content in the sense of who would this appeal to, and then it ends up appealing to a large audience and does very well for them. And it's not something that I'm going to necessarily watch, but that doesn't mean that I'm the type of person. I don't also watch a lot of TV. I just don't have time to watch a lot of TV. And when I do, I'm typically binging something very quickly. And that's not really how their type of content works. Their content works as you watch it. I say this, and literally I was on vacation. I was flying to my destination, and while I was flying, I watched a movie that happened to be on the plane. Also happened to be a movie that happened to be available on HBO Max as well. But I was watching the movie on the plane, and then I got done, and I was like, well, I only have about 45 minutes. I don't have enough time to start another movie. I look on the in-flight television, and they've got content from some of the Discovery networks, HGTV, Food Network, Discovery, TLC. And I start scanning through, and I was like, well, this is just something I could watch quickly because it's only 20 minutes an episode. I ended up just watching that because I used to watch a lot of HGTV years ago when I first bought a house. I used to watch HGTV with my wife a lot just to get ideas of what to do with our own house. That's not something I typically go out of my way to watch now, but it is something that I know of it, and I, know that it's that type of content where if you have a brief moment that you're looking for something to do and you're in a situation where you don't have a lot of other options, it's something that you might check out for even somebody like me who doesn't watch that stuff. So I can see why other people would appreciate it. But I think, honestly, one of the real highlights was Zaslav saying that there was going to be combined between what Discovery currently spends for their content per year and what Warner Brothers or Warner Media spends on their content, when you combine that number, it's over $20 billion that they combined and spend on content per year. That's an insane number.
It's more than Netflix, right?
It's more than Netflix, because Netflix was reportedly spending about $17 billion this year. That's more than Disney has been saying, which I think upwards of even their far projections into the next 5 years was $15 billion a year. So that's not to say it would necessarily stay at $20 billion. There's also word that by combining their resources, they're going to save about $4 billion on that content spending per year. But then they also said that they were going to pump that back into creating more content. So that means regardless of them saving money, they're just going to have more content for, a cheaper price, basically. And, there's very little that some companies can do, and be able to spend that much money on content and be able to, there's no way that NBC Universal has anywhere near that amount of money to spend on content, or Viacom CBS. They just don't have those numbers to do that. I think that's one of the huge things. But honestly, under his leadership, I think that we're going to see more content. There's even a bigger chance that it gets expanded, because think about all of the content that they are consistently adding to Discovery on a regular basis. They're constantly coming up with new things. And I think that there might be projects that might have been on that borderline of maybe getting a green light, maybe not getting a green light while it's under AT&T, because AT&T is crunching the numbers and, telling the people below them, hey, you're spending too much. And I think that might not be the case with this new company, because they'd be focused on the media aspect of it. They're focusing on the content and getting customers for the content, not necessarily getting the customer to use the service so that they can keep them as a customer for something else. And I think that's the big thing. I think the biggest takeaway from this entire thing is that it gets Warner Media out from underneath the thumb of AT&T, which I really truly believe has not helped them in any way, shape, or form, other than just maybe restructuring things and maybe consolidating some things. But I don't know that that's necessarily helped one way or the other. I wouldn't say that the content level at HBO has gone down since AT&T. That I don't think enough time has passed to really make that judgment. But I think that when it comes to the decisions that are being made, I think money's being spent in some ways and not in other ways. I think a lot of that has to do with AT&T really being careful about making sure that they can show stockholders that Warner Media is doing something good for them. And by getting the company to, spinning the company off to its own thing, it's going to make that not really that big of, it'll still be obviously a concern, because there will be new stockholders who will be investing in that new media company. But that their focus is going to be content, subscribers, customers, in that kind of sense. The same thing that Netflix deals with. It's not about how many customers did we retain using this other thing. That's not the case. And that's not to say there's not going to be a vertical integration when it comes to AT&T still utilizing the content, the stuff from HBO Max and potentially Discovery Plus, because they're still going to have those partnerships. That's what will happen. But that's the big aspect, I think, of the big takeaway from all of this, is that Warner Media and Discovery are going to be bigger players, a lot bigger really quickly, and they're going to not really have the reins held back by someone who doesn't understand media like they've had to do when they've been under AT&T.
No, I totally agree with that, but I think that there are other hidden benefits that are also really huge for Warner Media as a whole. One of them is HBO Max is currently in the United States. Yes, there are partnerships with different entities, in Europe or South America, right? And that's been a big issue with some European friends of mine. Of this, the Snyder Cut came out, or Kong versus Godzilla, whatever the actual name of that movie, or Mortal Kombat. The point is HBO Max is, from the technological side, has not done a good job, in my opinion, and they've had such big issues with their international rollout. We're Discovery Plus, right? What was it, like week 2 or 3? It just seemed like, hey, we're adding this international location, we're adding this international thing, we're doing blah 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 here, and now they're in a whole bunch of countries. I think there's a lot of focus on what the Warner Media catalog can do for Discovery Plus and the whole platform as a whole, but I think there's still a whole lot of things that Discovery brings in that will help, Warner Media. They know how to bring their business and their content to the international stage, right? They already have those relationships. They know how to do it. They've done those negotiations, once before, and they can, get it done again. And another thing that I think is important for Discovery Plus and what they offer is they have dived into this whole ad supported model before HBO Max has, and they've kind of worked out the kinks. They've just been in it longer just because her service is just doing better at it. And I think that HBO Max is right. They've signed. They're trying to figure out how to do this ad-supported model. And yes, they're trying to figure it out just due to HBO side. But in general, there's just been a lot of conversations of, okay, we were talking about this for probably like a year and a half almost, of how they're going to do this, and they haven't delivered, it seems like. And so I think that those two pieces combined can really of Discovery and what they offer will help Warner Media and help bring whatever you want to say about their streaming service, and if they merge or they do not merge, that tribal knowledge that Discovery has can definitely benefit Warner Media as a whole. And I think that that's something that it might be a little overlooked of. I would say Discovery Plus and the people there have more experience at running a streaming service than Warner Media. And although they've been in the game a little bit, less, I think that they've been more successful at it. And there's a lot of things there that they can teach to the Warner Media side of things.
Yeah.
I have one more question for you, and it's less technical, but more of, how do you think this merger will go down, right? Will it be more of a, the Viacom CBS, with that merge, they scrapped CBS All Access and created Paramount Plus, right? Just a culmination of two services, ended one service, combined the two, and then, they got it going. Or do you think it will be like a situation with Disney buying Fox, right? And then getting the other rights for Hulu from Comcast, right? So you have Hulu and then Disney Plus. It's kind of two distinct services. There is more integration happening, but at the moment they seem to be two independent services, and that's kind of the plan moving forward. Which on the spectrum do you think that this Warner Media Discovery Plus Discovery merger, how that's going to work?
I think
if you were to flip a coin.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what we're looking at. Is I think the talk is going to be, initially they're going to be talking about how it'll potentially be Discovery Plus will be a tier that you can add on to HBO Max, and it'll be a set price. But I think that'll be the initial talk. That's what everyone's going to talk about. But I think ultimately their best option is to just combine Discovery Plus and HBO Max into either HBO Max, bring the content from Discovery over, or, obviously it would probably be under some sort of new name or something like that. But I feel as if that would make the most sense, is to make all the content under the one, because you get an insane amount of content. And instead of, do what Disney did with the bundle, in the sense of like, yeah, you could keep them separate, but the problem is HBO Max is too expensive as it is to try to tack on something additional. When you look at the Disney bundle, it's successful because the amount of money you're paying for ESPN Plus, Hulu, and Disney Plus is relatively right around the same amount of money that you're paying for HBO Max. To tack on more money on top of HBO Max, I think that'd just be too much. I think you get way more customers to come to your service if, for the same price, you added all of that Discovery content to the whatever the service is called. Because I really do hope that they change the name, because I never liked the name of HBO Max. They come up with some new name and they rebrand it, and it just has all of this content, because then it really will be this massive library. And I really hope also this allows them to open the floodgates for some of the other Warner Brothers content out there that is out there, like the content that was on Boomerang, or some of the content that was on DC Universe, that content that sometimes they have this tendency to license out, but maybe because they're a media company and that's what their focus is, they're not looking at the return on the content immediately as much as they are looking for that return on making sure that the churn rate is lower by having that extra content. You look at Netflix, you look at Disney, you look at even Paramount Plus, this content that's on their services, they're bringing their content back. And I'm not saying Warner Brothers isn't doing that. They are doing that with some, but they still have so many licensing deals in place with some of their content that it's very difficult for it all to be under one roof. Now, you also have that argument of, well, too much content is too much. Why not? Which is the argument that we've heard from Warner Media as to why they don't have it, and it's just curated. But honestly, as we've talked about, if you combined news, sports, the Discovery content, the Warner Media library, all of that content under one roof, they truly would be a force to be reckoned with.
Oh, I totally agree. And they could just, instead of selling off Crunchyroll, they can just bring that in and add it to the thing. Yeah, I completely agree that they should just merge and get rid of both streaming services and just make a new one. So I was just thinking, I was like, there is a spectrum here of how you would do mergers. So I totally agree that they should just merge all to one, make a new go, and kind of start over with the reputation wise, just make something new.
All right. So obviously we're pretty far into our episode, and we've still got some other things to talk about. So let me talk about a couple of quick things. There was some new numbers that released. First up, Paramount Plus, they gained 6 million streaming subscribers as of the first quarter. So they're doing pretty well over at Paramount Plus. One of the things that's been attributed to their success is the fact that the SpongeBob movie that released right away when the service released, that drove some engagement right away. There was people who not only subscribed and watched the film right away, but also were watching other content that was related to that. So one of the announcements that they said when they were giving their numbers was that in 2022, they're planning on doing a movie a week on Paramount Plus. And that's obviously very similar to what we see Netflix trying to do. Now, the question, of course, is where are they suddenly going to get 52 movies for an entire year? Because they're not currently producing that many movies. And it turns out they've said that they're going to use some of their labels such as MTV, Nickelodeon, Awesomeness. They're going to create certain movies under these labels that will be part of these 52 movies that would release over the course of 2022. Obviously, they're big films like Quiet Place 2 or Quiet Place Part 2 or Top Gun, the Maverick, the newer movies, Mission Impossible. These movies will eventually come to the service and be included as those 52 movies, but they'll have a number of movies that will be releasing as well. It's probably going to be just like Netflix, where it's kind of a mix between hits and probably a bunch of misses because they're made for TV movies, or they're movies that are meant for, cable typically, because they're coming from, places like Nickelodeon or MTV. So there's that. So Paramount Plus is doing great. When you look over at Disney Plus, they also have new numbers. They've added 8.7 million subscribers in the last quarter, which is not as much as obviously some analysts had projected, but it does show that there's a situation forming at Disney where they've kind of hit a spot where, yeah, they're still going to go up, but they're not going to be seeing those massive increases that we've seen over the last year just because of, obviously, the global pandemic. They were also rolling out in a lot of international territories. This was one of the first quarters that they didn't have a massive rollout in international territory. So that explains why their numbers aren't as high as some analysts projected. But even so, steadily growing even at 10 million subscribers or even 5 million subscribers every quarter, they're still on course to be where they're projecting to be, around like 200 million subscribers with Disney Plus within the next 5 years. They're well within that range. So there's nothing to necessarily be worried about there. All right. So then the other big story, which we'll talk about, there's a little bit of some news, some sports news, but given how long we talked about Warner Media, I'm going to wrap up we'll wrap up the episode with another conversation real quick about another big merger, and we'll save the sports news for next episode because it's not, some of it's conjecture and some of it is some information. I'll just tell you the information. WNB has been signing a lot of streaming deals. They're going to ended up making some deals with Paramount Plus and Amazon. They're going to be having some of their games coming just at the end of this month to those platforms, as well as Twitter and Facebook as well. So there's that. The other part, which is there's a NBC Universal is exploring selling off some of their regional sports networks or potentially streaming them directly on Peacock. That one we're going to talk about on the next episode because I think that one deserves a little bit more conversation, but that is something that is it's a hypothetical thing. It's not been announced or anything like that, but I do want to spend a little bit more time. But the big other news that just came out in the last 2 days was that Amazon is reportedly looking at buying MGM. Now you may be saying, wait, wasn't Apple looking at buying MGM? Yes, that's true. They were at one point, but that deal fell apart. And the word is that Apple was looking at buying MGM. MGM valued themselves too high, and Apple decided they weren't interested. It turns out Comcast was also looking at potentially buying MGM to bolster the library for NBC Universal, and it was the same thing. MGM stated, they were valued at a specific amount, and Comcast decided, well, we don't think so, and we're not interested. So they passed. Now, however, Amazon is the new player that seems to be interested in MGM, and they're reportedly interested for about $9 billion to buy MGM. Now, getting MGM has, they produce a lot of television shows, and they have a library of, thousands of movies as well. One of the franchises that they have that's big is they have the James Bond franchise, and that would bring that content over to Amazon. It would bolster Amazon's content, and it would really put Amazon in a unique position where they would be having a lot more possibilities when it comes to the content that they could create by bringing basically a media company in that has made content but isn't necessarily as big as NBC Universal or Sony or Warner Media. So I think this works. I think it would have worked better with Apple personally, because I think Apple, it made more sense because, one, Apple is spending money on things. I think MGM is a little bit overvalued when it comes to $9 billion because they've also almost gone bankrupt like 3 times in the last 10 years. So there's that part of it too. But I think when it comes to Amazon and it comes to MGM, I think it could work. Like I said, I think it works better if it would have been like Apple who did this. But this is a similar situation to some of the other ones that we talked about earlier with Warner Media and Discovery, where if you are a media company, you are looking at these other potential opportunities to expand what you have, and there are not a lot of options out there. There is not a lot of potential companies that you can really, one, afford, and two, has the content that's really going to help you succeed. And I think MGM is one of the smaller ones that's left. There's very few that are left like that. There's some cable networks that might come into play, like somebody like AMC, which has a lot of smaller stuff. They're a company, but they're not huge. They have elements that could work for a company, but I don't think that they're big enough or have the content library to really warrant a large price tag or even warrant a lot of interest from some of the players that actually have the money to throw around anyway. There's just not a lot of these companies left. And I think that if MGM does end up going to Amazon, whether or not that works out, because obviously we've heard stories about MGM potentially going other places before and they just didn't pan out. If that does happen, it makes Amazon a bigger player when it comes to media, creating media in the content space in the near future.
One, I do agree that maybe MGM is a little too optimistic on themselves, are pricing themselves higher than they probably should. I'm going to push back. I think MGM's content would be good for Apple just to bolster their library, but I don't think it would help them gain a lot of subscribers. So in that sense, Apple needs subscribers, and I don't think any of their content will immediately be like, hey, it's driving subscriber growth. I think it actually works pretty good for Amazon, right? Like, yeah, you could buy some of the main MGM movies from Amazon Prime, but maybe they're trying to get people okay, well, we could put this content on it and you can get it free on Amazon Prime. I also see that there's a huge opportunity to actually bolster their IMDb TV service by like, hey, here's a lot of MGM content that we could put on there and make IMDb TV actually more enticing to what it is. I like a lot of content there, but I can definitely see with the MGM potential acquisition, I can see them bolster IMDb TV to actually be something of a little bit of a force within the streaming game. Like, yeah, it is a part of Amazon and Prime, and there's an association there. But if you invest a little bit, there's something to IMDb TV that could really help grow Amazon's presence in the streaming game. But, overall, Amazon does have the cash. So did Apple. I think conventional wisdom says, yeah, MGM would make more sense for Apple just given everything, but I think it makes sense for Amazon too, of how it could fit within their business model of they don't necessarily need to get subscribers at the moment, but they do need to bolster their content to keep, subscribers around, where Apple, they actually need to get people interested in the service. And unless you're releasing a James Bond film on Apple TV exclusive, I doubt that there's really anything there that would drive subscriber numbers significantly in the near term.
So for now, that's what we've got when it comes to that. Like I said earlier, if there is more that comes of the Amazon, we'll be talking about it, but there'll be more details about what it'll actually become if it actually ends up going through, because right now it's essentially hearsay. There's some rumblings from sources and things like that. It's not like it's not being at least talked about, but it's not something that's been finalized. It's not been something that's been actually announced from either one of the companies. I will say, however, that the Warner Brothers or Warner Media Discovery thing, that news broke on a Sunday evening, and then by Monday morning, that's when they officially announced it. And then John Stankey and Zaslav from Discovery, they were making the rounds, doing interviews and things, answering questions about the merger. So it's not to say that something couldn't happen in the near future. I mean, with horrible luck, we could release this episode and then all of a sudden something happens right away. But we'll be back in 2 weeks with another episode, and we'll be discussing any new rumblings when it comes to that. And like I said, we'll go back to that NBC Universal with the regional sports networks, because I do want to spend a little bit more time talking about that. And it's not a timed necessarily thing, because it's just something that's been talked about, but it hasn't been officially announced yet either, so we'll get back to that on the next episode. With all of that being said, be sure to check out our show notes, because we have all of these articles that we talked about here, as well as everything else that's happened within the streaming wars. You can find show notes at our website, thestreamingwars.io. You can also subscribe to us on YouTube. We have playlists that feature all of the trailers for all of the different services. As you are looking for new trailers to watch, if you subscribe to a certain service, you can check out our playlist and it'll show you all of the latest trailers from that specific service, or you can subscribe to multiple playlists and check out what we've got to offer. In addition to that, you can follow us on Twitter and join our Discord. That's where you'll find articles that we talk about here on the podcast, and then obviously a bunch of the other ones that we don't. Instagram is where you will find announcements related to new episodes of the podcast posting. And if you are interested, you can send us an email at thestreamingwars@gmail.com with any questions, comments, concerns, topics, or things you'd like us to discuss on future episodes. You can always leave feedback wherever you're listening to this podcast. That is always greatly appreciated. With all of that being said, for Tony and myself, this has been The Streaming Wars, and we'll see you guys next time.
Thanks for listening to The Streaming Wars. Check us out on Twitter and Instagram. Also consider supporting us on Patreon. Links can be found at thestreamingwars.io.